He rose cautiously and made his way to the bow, unbalanced and staggering in such blackness. With his hands on the rails, he leaned and looked down toward the water. The river mouthed the hull gently. After a minute, he realized he was standing on something, and he reached down to pick it up. It was a boot. He held it in his hands for a moment. Then he leaned and dropped it into the water. The boot tilted and filled and sank instantly as if a hand in the river had claimed it. He felt very cold. He did not know what to do. He groped his way along to the benches and sat and hugged himself and rocked back and forth. He could hear the whisper of water going up and down over the deck. It sounded as if it were looking for him. After a while, he cupped his hands and hallooed into the night. There was not even an echo. His voice fell from his mouth in a chopped bark, and he did not call again. He wondered how far away the shore could be and the dawn. Once in the night they went through a shoal, and he could hear the river going louder until it had risen to a babble, and the ferry swung away in a sickening yaw and slid down some rocky flume, him sitting helpless and blind, clutching the bench, his stomach lapsing down black and ropey glides, and the fog cold and wet upon him, praying silent and godless in his heart to the river to be easy. They came about in still water and went on. Much later, the fog lifted. He rose and watched out over the river. He could see the face of it in sullen and threatful replication, and after a while he could see a dark, mullioned line of trees. He could not tell how fast they were going, he and this boat. He had not thought of them turning either. But now the gradied imprecision of the silhouetted trees swung slowly away into a colorless vapor, and went behind him and crept forth again on the far side. And again. They had begun to move faster. When they swung a third time, he began to think that they were closer to the trees, and now, too, he could see the pale teeth of a rip in the river near the shore, and he could hear it like the stammerings of the cloistered mad. Very soon after this, he saw a light. It went away again before he could guess what kind of light it might be, but he watched for it. The barge had swung twice more, and now he was in eddy water almost beneath the dark wall of trees. He could feel the slide and bump of debris on the hull, the dull grinding of a log sliding under. The light appeared again. A pin flicker set in a glazed cup. He watched. It had begun to rain. He felt it very lightly on his arms and was surprised. He watched the light with his shoulder blades cocked against the chill and the rain falling upon him and soundlessly in the dark upon the peened and seething face of the river. At first he thought it to be a cabin, but it was not a cabin. It had no shape but what it took from breaking on the arch of trees above it, and he knew that it was a campfire. The barge had slowed. Some trees passed across the front of the fire, and he thought they were men, and then a man did cross it, an upright shape that seemed to be convulsed there for a moment before going from sight like something that had incinerated itself. He was very close to the bank now, but moving in a slick again and gaining speed. "Ho!" he called. He could see them move. He called again. "Who's there?" A voice came back. He already had a rope up from the bow and in his hand. Now, as the barge slid past a last clump of trees, there were 3 men standing on the bank of the river in the gentle rain, with the fire behind them, projecting their shapes outward into soaring darkness and with no dimension to them at all. "Catch a line," he called to them. "How many of you is they?" "Just me, here." He couldn't see their faces. He was moving before them and before the light, like someone in a stage prop being towed from wing to wing. "You want me to shoot him?" a voice said. "Shut up. Throw the line, mister." He held the line. He was trying to see them, but they were only silhouettes. Then the boat began to turn, and he could hear the sound of the river again, and he threw the line. It uncoiled across the water with a hiss, and he could see one of the men move and squat and rise again. "You got it?" he called. "Hitch it," one said. He had swung past them now and no longer could see them at all. He heard the rope saw along the gunwale and tauten, and there was a creaking sound as the ferry hove about, and he took 2 little steps to recover his balance. Some tree branches scratched along the hull and broke and came aboard. Then he was ashore, staving off brush with his arms and making his way through the woods toward the light. When he entered the little clearing, there were only 2 of them standing there. One was holding a rifle loosely in one hand and picking his teeth. The other stood with long arms dangling at his sides, slightly stooped, his jaw hanging and mouth agape in a slavering smile. The one with the rifle dropped his hand for a moment as if he might be going to speak, but he didn't. "I was on the ferry and it busted loose," Holme said. "That's it yander." He pointed vaguely to the darkness. Neither of them looked. They were watching Holme. "You wouldn't care for me to dry a little in front of your fire, would you? I'd be proud to tote wood." Neither of them spoke. Holme looked about him. The third one was standing just in the rim of light to his left, watching him. He was dressed in a dark and shapeless suit that could not have buttoned across his chest, and he wore a shirt with some kerchief or rag knotted at the neck. His face scowled redly out of a great black beard. He jerked his head at Holme. "Come up to the fire," he said. "Thank ye," Holmes said. "I'm wet plumb through and might near froze to boot." The other 2 turned slightly to follow him with their eyes, a predacious curiosity. Holme nodded to them as he passed, but they gave no sign of having noticed this. "Sit down," the bearded one said, motioning with his hand. "Thank ye," Holmes said. He squatted before the fire and extended his palms over it like some stormy and ruinous prophet. The small rain fell upon them silently, and wet wood sang in the flames. The bearded one watched him. "That river sure is up," Holmes said. "It is." "Ferryman went overboard." "What ferryman?" Holmes looked at him across the fire. "The ferryman," he said. "The one that was running that there ferry." "You ain't the ferryman." "No, I was just crossing the river. We never made it. They was another feller on a horse, and I reckon it got him too." The bearded one was leaning forward with interest. "Ah," he said. "You ain't the ferryman." "No," Holmes said. "It knocked him plumb out of his boots. That cable did when it busted. Sounded like a cannon load of cats going by." "Well, now," the bearded one said, "I allowed you was the ferryman." "No," Holmes said. "It was like I told ye." The bearded one was watching him very intently. He looked down at the fire. On a rock was a pan of black and mummified meat. He watched the fire and rubbed his hands together. The other 2 had come up and were squatting half in darkness, watching him. The bearded one looked toward them, and Holme looked at the pan of meat again. "Help yourself to some meat there if you're hungry," the man said. Holme swallowed and glanced at him again. In the upslant of light, his beard shone and his mouth was red, and his eyes were shadowed lunettes with nothing there at all. "What kind is it?" The man didn't answer. Holme looked to the fire. "I really ain't a bit hungry," he said, "but I'd admire to dry this here shirt, if you don't care." The man nodded. He started to pull the wet shirt off, and as he jerked his arms forward, he felt the cloth part soundlessly down the back. He stopped and reached behind him gingerly. "Looks like you about out of a shirt," the man said. "Yes," he said. He peeled the shirt from him and looked at it, holding it up before the fire. "You ain't it," the man said. Holmes' stomach turned coldly. "Ain't no need to be backwards about it. Get all you want. We've done it." He laid the shirt across his knees, reached gingerly, and took a piece of the blackened meat from the pan and bit into it. It had the consistency of wang, was dusted with ash, tasted of sulfur. He tore off a bite and began chewing, his jaws working in a hopeless circular motion. The bearded one nodded. "And a rider," he said. What?" Holmes said. "A rider." "Yes." "Ah," he said. "Old Crazy Horse like to have killed me," Holmes said. Whatever it was had swollen in his mouth and taken on a pulpy feel, warped and run with unassailable fibers. He chewed. "Where was it you was headed?" the man said. He worked the clot of meat into one cheek. "I was just crossing the river," he said. "I wasn't headed no place special." "No place special?" "No." "Ah," the man said. Holme chewed. "I don't believe I ever et no meat of this kind," he said. "I ain't sure I ever did either," the man said. He stopped. "You ain't et none of this?" he said. The man didn't answer for a minute. Then he said, "They's different kinds." "Oh," Holmes said. The one with the rifle across his squatting thighs giggled. "Ain't they?" he said. "Shot poke? Pole?" The bearded one didn't say anything. He just looked at him and he hushed. "Ain't no such a thing," he said. "Don't pay him no mind, mister. Pull in a little closter there. You, Harmon, get some wood." The one with the rifle rose and handed it to the one who had not spoken and disappeared. "I'd be proud to help fetch some wood," Holmes said. "You just set," the man said. "You don't need to worry about it." He chewed. "That is a Jim Dandy pair of boots you got there," the man said. Holmes looked at the boots. He had sat and they were stretched sideways along the fire. One crossed over the other. "They all right," he said. "Yes." "I wished it'd let up raining," Holmes said. "Don't you?" "Yes," the man said. "What did ye do with the horse?" "What horse?" "The rider's horse." "I didn't do nothing with him. He'd like to have killed me. Commenced tearing up and down like something crazy till he run plumb off in the river." "More horse than ye could handle, was it?" "I couldn't even see it." "Or maybe you was afraid to take it. That makes sense." "I don't need no horse," Holmes said. No. Get you some more meat there. I still got some, Holmes said. The man turned his head. Harmon had come up with a load of wet limbs, and now he dumped them on the ground and knelt in the loamy river soil and began to arrange them before the fire to dry. The man waited. Then he said, "Sit down." Harmon squatted on his haunches and folded his arms about his shin bones. "Well," the man said, turning to Holme, "you've sat there and dried and warmed and et, but you've not said your name. A feller didn't know, he'd think you wanted it kept for a secret." "I don't care to tell it," Holmes said. "Folks don't commonly ask where I come from." "We ain't in them places," the man said. "Holme," Holmes said. "Holme," the man repeated. The word seemed to feel bad in his mouth. He jerked his head vaguely toward the one with the rifle. "That ain't got a name," he said. "He wanted me to give him one, but I wouldn't do it. He don't need nary. You ever see a man with no name afore?" "No." "No," the man said. "Not likely." Holme looked at the one with the rifle. "Everything don't need a name, does it?" the man said. "I don't know. I don't reckon." "I guess you'd like to know mine, wouldn't you?" "I don't care," Holmes said. "I said I guess you'd like to know mine, wouldn't you?" "Yes," Holmes said. The man's teeth appeared and went away again as if he had smiled. "Yes," he said. "I expect they's lots would like to know that." Holmes wiped his mouth on his naked arm and tried to swallow, and then went on chewing. It was very quiet. He listened, but he could hear no sound anywhere in the woods or along the river, not of owl or night bird or distant hounds. "Some things is best not named," the man said. "Harmon here," he gestured toward the squatting figure. "That's his right name. I like for him to set and listen, even if he can't understand much." Holmes nodded. "I like for him to have the opportunity." "Yes." Harmon did not appear to be listening. He was gazing into the fire like a lean and dirty cat. "He might know something, and him and me neither one know about it," the man said. "Besides, I'd like for him to sit there and listen and maybe mend the fire." Harmon moved. He did not stop looking at the fire, but he leaned and groped with one hand until he had hold of some wood, and he poked a few pieces into the wasting flames. Holmes could see the third one squatting on the far side with the rifle upright between his knees and his face resting against the side of the barrel. "I like to keep the fire up," the man said. "They might be somebody else coming." Holmes swallowed the leached and tasteless wad of meat, his eyeballs tilting like a toad's with the effort. "I would doubt they was," he said. The bearded one didn't seem to hear. He stretched his feet forth and crossed them and recrossed them. Holmes reached toward the pan before he thought, and checked too late. He lifted a sour black chunk of meat and bit into it. "Now these here old boots of mine," the man said, "is plumb wore out." Holmes looked at the boots. They were cracked and weather-blackened, and one was cleft from tongue to toe like a hoof. He looked at Harmon, and he looked at the fire, chewing. "Ain't they?" the man said. "I reckon," Holmes said. He rearranged the shirt and felt of it. "Get you some more meat there," the man said. "Thank ye," Holmes said. "I've a plenty." Did that ferryman not have nary better shirt than that? What? I said, did that ferryman not have no better a shirt on him than that? I never noticed his shirt. The man watched him. After a minute, he turned to Harmon. He says he never noticed his shirt, he said. Harmon squeezed his shins and giggled and nodded his head up and down. The man had stretched out before the fire and was propped up on one elbow. He said, I wonder where a fellow might find him a pair of bull-hide boots like them you got. Holmes' mouth was dust dry, and the piece of meat seemed to have grown bigger in it. I don't know, he said. Don't you? He turned the shirt again. He was very white and naked sitting there. They was give to me, he said. They look a mite turned up at the toes, the man said. Did they not know your size? They was bought for somebody else. He died, and I got 'em give to me, is how come they a little big. They all right. The man shifted slightly and raised one of his own broken boots and looked at it and lowered it again. Holmes could see part of one naked foot within the rent leather. I reckon a dead man's boots is better than near no boots atoll, the man said. He felt cold all over. Harmon raised his head and looked at him, and even the one with the rifle that had appeared to be sleeping had now opened his eyes without moving at all, and was regarding him with malign imbecility. You say you was just going across the river? The man said. Holmes' voice came out quavering and alien. He heard it with alarm. I was hunting my sister, he said. She run off, and I've been hunting her. I think she might have run off with this here tinker, little old scrawny-looking kind of a feller. Herself, she's just young. I've been hunting her since early in the spring, and I can't have no luck about finding her. She ain't got nobody but me to see about her. There ain't no telling what all kind of mess she's got into. She was sick, anyways. She never was a real stout person. The man was listening closely, but what he said next, I wouldn't name him, because if you can't name something, you can't claim it. You can't talk about it even. You can't say what it is. I got Harmon to look after him if they do fight. I keep studying him. He's close, but I keep at it. Holmes stared at him. The man had sat up again and had his legs crossed before him. He's the one set the skiff adrift this morning, he said. Even if it just drifted off, he still done it. I know there's a reason. We waited all day and half the night. I kept up a good fire. You seen it, didn't you? Yes, Holmes said. How come ye to run your sister off? The man said. I never. How come her to run off? I don't know. She just run off. You don't know much, do ye? Holmes looked past him and past Harmon to the one with the rifle. He appeared to be sleeping, but he wasn't sleeping. He looked at the man again. I ain't bothered you, he said. I ain't in a position to be bothered. Holmes didn't answer. That ain't the way it is, the man said. Holmes leaned slightly forward and held his elbows. He could feel the meat weighty and truculent in the pit of his stomach. Is it? The man said. No. Get you another piece of meat, Yander. I've got about all I can hold. You know, I would think them there big boots would chafe on a feller's heels, the man said. They all right, Holmes said. I don't believe they are, the man said. Are what? All right, I don't believe they are. Well, it don't make no difference. When I believe something, it makes a difference. Holmes watched the fire. In his unfocused vision, the coals beaded up in pins of light and drifted like hot spores. Blood had come up in his ears, and they were warm and half deaf with it. I don't care, he said. You will care, mister. I think maybe you are somebody else, because you don't seem to understand me very much. Now get them boots off. Harmon looked up and smiled. Holme looked at the man. The fire had died some, and he could see him better, sitting beyond it, and the scene compressed into a kind of depthlessness, so that the black woods beyond them hung across his eyes oppressively, and the man seemed to be seated in the fire itself, cradling the flames to his body as if there were something there beyond all warming. He reached and slid the boots from his feet, one, the other, and stood them before him. Harmon, the man said. Harmon rose and came for the boots and took them to the man. The man seized them and examined them, bending closer to the fire, turning them in his hands like some barbaric cobbler inspecting the work of another world. He pulled off his own boots and put on these new ones, and stood in them and took 3 steps up and 2 back, and turned. Harmon had gathered up the old boots and was putting them on. The one with the rifle watched happily. All right, the bearded one said. Holmes squatted with his naked feet beneath him. Fix his, the man said. Harmon carried the boots he had discarded to the one with the rifle and stood them before him. The one with the rifle looked at them and looked up at Harmon. Harmon took the rifle from him and kicked at the empty boots. Do 'em for him, the man said. Harmon knelt and pulled off the nameless one's boots and pushed the other boots at him. Then he rose with these boots and turned. The man gestured. Holme watched, squatting shoeless and half naked. Harmon came toward him smiling, the rifle in one hand and the last pair of boots in the other. He dropped them alongside Holme and stood looking down at him. Holme looked at the bearded one. Them's for you, the man said. Holme looked at them. They were mismatched, cracked, shapeless, burnt-looking, and crudely mended everywhere with bits of wire and string. He looked at the nameless one who sat likewise barefoot with a pair of boots before him. Relieved of the rifle, his hands lay on the ground on either side of him, and he was watching Holme. Holme looked away. I said them ones there is yourn, the man said. Holme looked at the boots again, then took one up slowly and pulled it onto his foot. A sour reek welled out of the top. You don't have much to say, do you? The man said. No. I guess you think maybe you and me should have traded. I don't care, Holmes said. I believe in taking care of my own, the man said. That's the way I think. Every man thinks his own way, Holmes said. Leave him alone, Harmon. Harmon stepped away from him. Sometime it had stopped raining. Holme hadn't noticed. He had not felt the rain on his naked back, the small rain that died in the fire soundlessly. "You may see the time you wish you had worse," the man said. Holme made a small, helpless gesture with one hand. "Where was you heading, sure enough?" "Nowheres," Holmes said. "Nowheres?" "No." "You may get there yet," the man said. He came along the edge of the fire and stopped, looking down at Holme. Holme could see only his legs and those of Harmon a little further beyond. The fire had burned low, and there was but a single cleft and yellow serpent tongue of flame standing among the coals. A third pair of boots came up, and Holme looked at them. They stood slightly toed and on the wrong feet. "That ain't all, is it?" the man said. "I ain't got nothing else," Holmes said. The man spat past him into the fire. "Something else," he said. "Have you got a sister, sure enough?" "I done told ye." "Run off with some tinker?" "Yes." "She ain't here to tell it her way, is she?" "No." "And where do you reckon they've got to by now?" "I don't know." "Just further on down the road, don't you reckon?" "Yes, I reckon. I ain't studied it." "Ain't studied it?" "No." He seemed to be speaking to the fire. When he lifted his head, he could see the three of them standing there watching him, ragged, filthy, threatful. "Yes," the man said. "You've studied it." Holme didn't answer. He turned his face to the fire again. "Harmon," the man said, "leave him be." Holme didn't look up. He heard their steps receding out of the firelight among the wet leaves toward the river where the ferry was tied. He had the shirt clutched in both hands and was staring in mute prayer at the wand of flame that trembled before him so precariously, and he did not move at all. Then he heard steps coming back. He lifted his head. Harmon came smiling out of the dark like an apparition. He did not have the rifle. He did not have anything in his hands. He slouched toward Holme and bent over him. Holme recoiled. Harmon didn't seem to notice. He took up the pan and tilted the remaining meat into the fire and clicked the pan against a rock and stepped back and turned and was gone. Holme could see one of the chunks in the bright coals. It lay there soundless as stone and apparently impervious to flame. He did not move. He listened for their voices, but he could hear nothing. After a very long time, he could hear the river again, and even though the fire had died, he did not move. Later still he heard a mockingbird, or perhaps some other bird.